Did you know that not all gladiators were just victims of the arena? Some were highly trained warriors, and their fight for freedom is more layered than you might expect. Imagine being thrown into a brutal world where your life is nothing but a spectacle for the masses. Gladiators, often thought of simply as slaves fighting for survival, were much more than that. They weren't just victims of the empire's cruelty. In many cases, they were skilled fighters with a sharp sense of self-preservation, fighting for freedom in a world that rarely offered any. Gladiators were often portrayed as mere pawns, people who were enslaved and forced to fight for the entertainment of the Roman public, but the reality is far more complicated. Many gladiators were indeed slaves, captured from distant lands or condemned to the arena for crimes they committed. However, others volunteered, drawn by the promise of fame, fortune, or a way out of poverty. They entered the games not because they had no choice, but because they saw a chance to escape their circumstances in a brutal but potentially rewarding system. What's even more surprising is the sheer level of skill many gladiators had. These men weren't just armed with swords and shields. They were trained in combat techniques that made them some of the most fearsome fighters in the empire. They endured brutal training routines, learning everything from hand-to-hand combat to advanced weaponry, making them capable of fighting with precision and efficiency. Some of them, having survived the endless rounds of combat, became legends in their own right. They weren't just killing machines. They were highly skilled warriors who could hold their own against trained Roman soldiers. This is where the story starts to shift. Gladiators, despite their status as slaves or underprivileged fighters, held a level of influence that most people never realized. The arena wasn't just a place for blood and spectacle. It was a microcosm of Roman society, a tool of control. When gladiators fought, it wasn't merely for survival or entertainment. Their fights symbolized Rome's immense power and dominance over not just their fighters, but over all those who dared challenge its empire. The games were meant to be a reminder to the public of Roman strength, both military and moral. But what many didn't know was that the gladiators were fighting against more than just their opponents. They were fighting the very system that enslaved them. It was in these blood-soaked sands that some gladiators found the courage to rebel. The concept of rebellion wasn't new to the gladiators. For centuries, uprisings had been a constant threat in Rome, but gladiators had something that made their revolts unique. They had the training, the strategy, and the will to fight. These weren't just mobs of slaves. They were organized, disciplined warriors fighting for their freedom. Some gladiators, like Spartacus, became household names. Their stories are the stuff of legend. But what many don't realize is that Spartacus wasn't the only gladiator to lead a rebellion. There were other uprisings, less famous but no less significant, where gladiators and slaves alike rose up against their masters. These rebellions weren't just about fighting for freedom. They were about challenging the very fabric of Roman society. They were moments where the oppressed stood up to the empire, testing its strength in ways no one could have predicted. The fight for freedom in ancient Rome wasn't just about the individual gladiator. It was about a larger battle against an oppressive system that kept millions in chains. Gladiators, despite their brutal training and bloody combat, became symbols of resistance. Their fight wasn't just about survival. It was about showing Rome that even the most oppressed had the strength to challenge the might of the empire. You might be wondering, did all gladiators share the same goal? The truth is, no. Not all gladiators rebelled. Some sought personal glory and fame in the arena, aiming to become champions and earn their freedom through victories. Others fought for political change, believing that the entire system that enslaved them needed to be dismantled. And while some might have seen the arena as their only way out, others saw rebellion as a path to challenge the Roman system itself. Truth is that the gladiators' rebellion wasn't a simple black and white struggle for freedom. It was a complex web of individual desires, political motives, and, most importantly, a challenge to the very power structure of Rome. These gladiators fought not only with swords but with ideas. Ideas about what it meant to be free, what it meant to be human, and what it meant to live under an empire that didn't care about their lives beyond the arena. What makes these rebellions even more surprising is how some gladiators went on to become icons of Roman society. Despite the brutality of their lives, some gladiators were able to rise above circumstances and gain status and respect. They were no longer just slaves or pawns in Rome's power play. They became symbols of resistance, challenging Rome in ways that no one had anticipated. In the end, the gladiators' fight for freedom wasn't just a battle in the arena. It was a fight for dignity, for respect, and for the very right to control their own destinies. They were warriors in every sense of the word, and their story continues to echo through history as a reminder of the power of resistance in the face of overwhelming odds. So, were gladiators simply victims, or were they warriors fighting for their own freedom and dignity? The answer is far more complex than most people think. These gladiators weren't just pawns in a brutal system. They were rebels, heroes, and warriors. Their fight was for more than survival. It was for the very right to live on their own terms. You may have heard of Spartacus, but what if I told you there were multiple gladiator rebellions, each with its own surprising twists? Gladiator uprisings were far more common than most people realize. In fact, Spartacus wasn't the only gladiator to defy Rome. These rebellions didn't just threaten the empire's power. They revealed the cracks in its very foundation, and the story behind them is one that many history books overlook. You see, gladiators weren't just fighting for freedom. They were fighting for the very survival of their beliefs. But what did this truly mean? Spartacus is often seen as the face of gladiator resistance, but that's only part of the story. He's famous for leading a massive slave revolt that lasted for years, but he was not alone in his fight. Gladiators like Crixus, Gannicus, and many others also took up arms against their captors, each with their own reason for rebellion. Spartacus is the one who captured the public's imagination, but the truth is, gladiator uprisings were more common than we think, and in many cases, they were more about fighting for personal freedom than about undermining Rome's entire political system. One of the things most people don't realize is that these uprisings weren't always about grand political ideals. Yes, they symbolized resistance to Rome's harsh system, but they were also deeply personal. Many gladiators saw their rebellions as a form of revenge. Some of them were slaves, captured in battle or condemned for crimes they never committed, but even those who entered the arena voluntarily were treated as less than human. To many, the rebellion was an opportunity to reclaim their honor, their pride, and their agency. These rebellions weren't just a reaction to the violence of the arena. They were a direct challenge to Rome's very system of power. Gladiators, no matter their status or reason for fighting, had one thing in common. They were forced to live in a system where they had no control over their own lives, and the brutal nature of the arena reflected the cruelty of Rome itself. It wasn't enough to simply survive the games. Gladiators were expected to entertain the masses with their deaths, to spill blood for the amusement of a society that saw them as disposable. But that's where the story gets interesting. Despite the brutal conditions, some gladiators didn't just survive, they thrived. They became heroes of the arena, adored by the masses for their courage and skill. Some of these gladiators, like Spartacus, were able to rally other slaves and fighters to their cause, but their rebellion wasn't just about survival. It was about challenging the Roman system of power, about exposing the weaknesses of an empire that thought it could control everything and everyone. It wasn't just the warriors who fought in the arena who were challenging Rome. It was the very idea that the Roman Empire's power was unshakable. Gladiator uprisings were not spontaneous. They were planned, carefully calculated, and executed by men who had experience in the art of war. Many of the gladiators who rebelled had military training, which gave them the skills they needed to fight back against the might of Rome's legions. The first thing you might think about gladiators is that they were untrained slaves, desperate and unable to fight back. But the truth is far different. These men were warriors, and they fought like warriors. Their experience in battle made them formidable opponents, even to the most seasoned Roman soldiers. So, why were these rebellions largely ignored by history? Well, the answer is complicated. For one, gladiators were, by definition, slaves or prisoners of war. They weren't considered worthy of historical recognition. Their deaths in the arena were seen as just another spectacle, a way to entertain the masses, not an act of defiance. When these men turned the tables and fought back, they posed a threat to the very system that had used them as pawns. Rome couldn't afford to let the story of the gladiator uprising gain too much attention. To do so would be to acknowledge the cracks in the empire's power, cracks that were exposed not by armies, but by these seemingly powerless men. One of the most interesting aspects of these gladiator uprisings is how they challenged not only the Roman Empire's military might, but also its economic structure. Gladiatorial games were expensive to organize, and they were a form of political currency. Elites would sponsor the games to gain favor with the masses and secure their position within Roman society. Gladiators weren't just fighters, they were a symbol of Rome's wealth and power. But when these gladiators turned on their masters, they disrupted that system. They were no longer tools of entertainment. They were symbols of rebellion, and that's what made their actions so powerful. They were fighting for more than just their freedom. They were fighting to destroy the very system that kept them enslaved. And yet, as we talk about these uprisings, we must remember that not all gladiators had the same motivation. Some were motivated by a deep sense of personal vengeance, seeking revenge against the empire that had enslaved them. Others sought political change, hoping to bring down the empire from within. Some simply wanted to escape the arena and find freedom elsewhere. This diversity of motivations made these uprisings all the more complicated. Some gladiators wanted revenge, others wanted revolution, and still others just wanted to survive. And that's what made these rebellions so unpredictable and so dangerous for Rome. But there's a twist. While some gladiators rebelled because they were fighting for their freedom, others fought to maintain their status as heroes of the arena. Some gladiators who had won fame and fortune through their victories had the option to leave the arena and live a relatively comfortable life. But for many, the idea of becoming a champion and living a life of luxury was not enough. They wanted more. They wanted control. They wanted to challenge the very system that had turned them into objects of entertainment. This internal conflict made the gladiator uprisings even more unpredictable. It wasn't just about fighting for survival. It was about fighting for something much larger than themselves. In the end, these uprisings weren't just about freedom. They were about power. They were about the desire to control one's destiny in a world that was designed to strip that control away. The gladiators' fight wasn't just a physical struggle. It was a battle for autonomy in a society that had no place for those who dared to defy it. And while Spartacus is remembered as the face of this struggle, the truth is that there were many gladiators who fought and died in pursuit of this same goal. What if I told you that Macrinus, an emperor who ruled for only a short time, played a key role in shaping the story of gladiators and rebellion? He wasn't the emperor many many people expected, and his reign had surprising, long-lasting effects on the history of Rome and its gladiators. But here's the twist: he wasn't a member of the Roman aristocracy. He wasn't born into wealth or military power like most emperors. Instead, Macrinus rose to power through a series of political maneuvers, using his wit and cunning to secure the imperial throne. Macrinus' reign wasn't just short, it was chaotic and filled with constant challenges to his authority. He ascended to the position of emperor after the assassination of Carus, his predecessor, but instead of being embraced by Rome's elites, he quickly became the target of suspicion and resentment. Why? Because he was a man who didn't fit the mold. He wasn't a senator or a general with a strong lineage. He was a man of humble origins, a man who lacked the prestige and connections that other emperors had. His reign was destined to be turbulent from the very start. What makes Macrinus' story so important is how his reign intersected with the gladiator uprisings. His rule was marked by a series of challenges that threatened Rome's stability, but it was also a time when gladiators, those very symbols of Rome's might, became unexpected symbols of resistance. The gladiators weren't just fighting for their survival in the arena, they were fighting for something much bigger. They were challenging the very power structure of Rome, and Macrinus found himself caught in the middle of it. Macrinus tried to maintain control over the empire, but his efforts were consistently undermined by political intrigue, military rebellion, and even the gladiator uprisings that took root during his reign. The gladiators who rose up were not the powerless slaves many people imagined them to be. They were skilled warriors, many of whom had military experience. These uprisings, fueled by a desire for revenge and freedom, exposed the cracks in Roman society. They showed the world that even those who were considered the lowest in Roman society, the gladiators, had the power to challenge the very system that kept them enslaved. But there's more to the story. Macrinus' decisions regarding the military and gladiators were controversial, and they only deepened his troubles. In an effort to maintain control, he made critical mistakes in handling the Roman army. The military was his greatest tool for holding on to power, yet Macrinus failed to secure the loyalty of his generals and soldiers. His inability to align himself with the powerful military factions in Rome weakened his position and left him vulnerable to uprisings. One of the key factors that led to Macrinus' downfall was his decision to confront the gladiator rebellions head-on. He tried to use the full force of Rome's military to suppress the uprisings, but it wasn't enough. Why? Because he underestimated the strength and coordination of the gladiators. They weren't just fighting for freedom, they were fighting for an entire system to collapse. And this was where Macrinus made a critical error. Rather than seeing the gladiator revolts as a sign of deep discontent with Rome's political and social systems, he saw them as mere disturbances that needed to be crushed quickly. What most people don't know is that gladiator rebellions weren't simply about a group of slaves rising up. They were a direct challenge to the entire Roman power structure. These revolts exposed the flaws in the way Rome governed. They revealed the weakness in the empire's military structure and showed that the Roman people and even the gladiators were beginning to lose faith in their rulers. The gladiators were not just fighting for their own freedom, they were fighting for a better future for all the oppressed people in the empire. Macrinus' reign was also marked by a lack of trust from the Roman Senate and the elite. They viewed him as a temporary figure, someone who wasn't worthy of the imperial throne. His failure to win over the political class and military leadership put him in a precarious position. Gladiator uprisings, while not directly caused by Macrinus himself, certainly contributed to the chaos that ultimately led to his downfall. The gladiators were a symbol of resistance, but they also showed that Rome's military might could be challenged from within. The gladiators had become symbols of defiance, and Macrinus' inability to manage their revolt signaled his inability to manage Rome's larger issues. His short reign was a dramatic turn in Rome's history. Despite his attempts to regain control, Macrinus couldn't stop the rise of the gladiators, the corruption within the Roman elite, and the growing dissatisfaction among the people. As uprisings grew in strength, Macrinus found himself unable to stop the tide of rebellion. In the end, the gladiators' revolt wasn't just about a battle for freedom, it was a battle for the soul of Rome. And Macrinus, despite his clever political maneuvers, could not save himself from the inevitable collapse of his reign. In a dramatic twist, Macrinus was eventually assassinated by those who once supported him. The very military leaders he had trusted turned on him, and his enemies saw his death as a way to restore stability to the empire. But even in death, Macrinus' legacy remained. His failure to deal with the gladiator uprisings and his inability to unite Rome's military and political factions highlighted the deep divisions in Roman society. His reign may have been short, but it set the stage for one of the most tumultuous periods in Roman history. You might think of Macrinus as a forgotten emperor, one who was simply swept away by the tides of history. But his reign is more significant than most realize. It reveals how fragile the Roman Empire truly was, how easily a strongman could fall when faced with a system that was crumbling from within. His story is a warning to anyone who tries to wield power without understanding the complexity of the system they govern. The gladiators' rebellion wasn't just a revolt against individual emperors, it was a revolt against the very heart of Rome's imperial system, and in that revolt, Macrinus played an unexpected and tragic role. How does an army that exists to maintain control become the very tool of revolt? The relationship between gladiators and the Roman military wasn't as simple as you might think. Roman soldiers were often tasked with quelling during uprisings, keeping the empire's grip tight on the provinces. But when gladiators began to rise up, things didn't go according to plan. These were not the typical insurgents. They were highly trained warriors, many of whom had military backgrounds. In fact, some gladiators were former soldiers, captured in battle or forced into servitude, yet they retained their combat skills. This creates a striking paradox. The very soldiers that the Roman Empire depended on to maintain order were increasingly facing the reality that some of their greatest enemies were the gladiators they had helped to enslave. Gladiators were far from the powerless, untrained victims we often imagine. When they fought for freedom, they weren't just using brute strength. They were using the same military tactics they had learned in the army. This made them formidable foes, especially when they organized in large numbers and began to resist the might of the Roman legions. It's a little-known fact, but many of the gladiator uprisings were initially so successful because of this military knowledge. Gladiators knew how to march, fight, and strategize like soldiers. This gave them a clear advantage when they rose against the empire. They weren't just chaotic mobs, they were disciplined warriors with a sense of purpose, out to reclaim their freedom. The rebellion led by Spartacus, for example, was successful not because it was a desperate attempt, but because it was well organized and executed. These gladiators were veterans of combat, able to leverage their military experience to hit at Rome's weakest points. But there's more to the story than just trained fighters battling for freedom. Roman soldiers didn't always have the moral high ground in this fight. Surprisingly, some soldiers, even those tasked with quelling the uprisings, sympathized with the gladiators. Imagine being a soldier who had fought for Rome, seeing the empire's brutal treatment of those under its control. The gladiators weren't just fighting for themselves, they were fighting against the very system that used them as pawns. Some Roman soldiers, disillusioned with the empire's corruption, began to question their role in maintaining that power. These internal divisions within the Roman military made the gladiator uprisings even more complicated and dangerous. In fact, the Roman military's involvement in gladiator rebellions wasn't just about quashing revolts, it was about protecting the empire's reputation. Power was founded on the idea that it was invincible, that its legions could crush any threat. But when gladiators, once the empire's disposable entertainment, began to threaten its stability, it was a crisis of perception. Rome had built its empire on the belief that it could control its people, but the gladiators' success proved otherwise. It wasn't just the empire's soldiers that were at risk, it was its very image as an unstoppable force. The rebellion didn't just challenge the physical strength of Rome's legions, it exposed the empire's vulnerability. The very soldiers who were supposed to protect the empire were forced to fight against those who were supposed to be their entertainment. This conflict was symbolic of the deeper cracks within Roman society. The gladiators, once seen as tools of Rome's dominance, had turned into a threat, challenging not just the military, but the very political structure of the empire. Here's where the tension rises. Roman soldiers weren't just trying to suppress the uprisings, they were trying to preserve the Roman identity itself. Close control over the gladiators, to see them rise up as a unified force, was to admit that the Roman system was flawed, that it could be challenged. The games, once a source of pride and power for Rome, now represented the cracks in its foundation. For every gladiator that won in the arena, the image of Roman superiority was reinforced. But when they turned that fighting spirit against the empire, it shattered the illusion of invincibility. This conflict wasn't just about soldiers versus gladiators. It was a deeper struggle about the survival of Rome's system. The army's role shifted from being the ultimate enforcer of order to a symbol of the empire's decay. Soldiers who had once been proud of their role in keeping the empire strong began to question whether they were serving an empire worth protecting. The military's role in suppressing the gladiator uprisings was not just to quell rebellion, it was to protect the entire structure of Rome, from its military to its political leadership. As the gladiator uprisings spread and grew in strength, the Roman military found itself facing an existential crisis. The legions were no longer just fighting to quell uprisings, they were fighting to maintain the very image of Rome. Rome's untouchable was now being challenged by those it had oppressed, and that was a problem that went beyond simply defeating a group of rebels. It was about maintaining control over an empire that had started to lose its grip on power. So what does this mean for our understanding of the gladiator uprisings? It's not just about the rebellion of the gladiators, it's about the cracks in the Roman Empire that their resistance exposed. Gladiators weren't just fighting for freedom, they were fighting for a new kind of Rome, one that could no longer be controlled by force. This was a fight that threatened not only the military, but the very ideals that Rome had built itself upon. It's easy to think of the Roman military as a monolithic force of power, always in control, always ready to crush dissent. The gladiators, trained in battle and unified by a common cause, were more than just slaves. They were warriors fighting against an empire that, despite its strength, was beginning to unravel. And that struggle for control over the empire's power, whether through force or ideology, would change Rome forever. This dynamic between gladiators and the military is crucial to understanding the true impact of the gladiator rebellions. It wasn't just about the revolt of a few slaves, it was a rebellion that threatened the very core of Rome's identity. The military, once a symbol of Roman dominance, had to confront the reality that the gladiators they had forced to fight for entertainment were now challenging the very foundation of the empire. Gladiators were slaves, but the games they fought in weren't just blood sports. They were a reflection of Rome's power and values, and they impacted more than just the fighters. The games were a spectacle of strength, but they also carried a dark undercurrent of control. For the elites, gladiatorial combat was an incredibly effective tool to maintain power over the Roman masses. At the heart of it all, gladiators were symbols of Rome's might, but in reality, they were caught in a brutal system that used them for entertainment. But here's the strange fact that might make you rethink everything. While these men fought to the death in front of thousands, their popularity made them more influential than many senators, military commanders, or even emperors. The gladiatorial games, while seen as a form of entertainment for the masses, were also one of the strongest symbols of Roman domination. They showcased the empire's ability to subdue not just people, but entire cultures, turning them into a spectacle for public amusement. You may have thought the gladiators were mere pawns in this massive Roman system, but they weren't just there to be butchered for sport. These men, often trained in large schools called aludiag, had their own skills and sometimes even their own fan bases. They became legends, the real stars of their time. And for the people, these men were heroes. The public's fascination with gladiators was so profound that they began to influence the very political landscape of Rome. Gladiators weren't just slaves, they were political figures, representing the brutal might and pride of the empire, but also, in many cases, defying the very system they were forced to serve. Public opinion, the attitudes of ordinary Roman citizens, played a crucial role in how gladiator rebellions were viewed. Gladiators were often romanticized by the crowds, their fights seen as a heroic struggle, and when gladiators fought back, when they rose up, it wasn't just a battle for freedom, it was a challenge to the very notion of Roman superiority. But the surprising twist is that some of the empire's elite were also watching, and sometimes even supporting, these rebels. Gladiator uprisings weren't solely a revolt of the oppressed, they became a political statement about the cracks in the empire's power. The games were a tool of control, but they also exposed the fragility of that control. Rome's military might was unquestionable when it came to foreign enemies, but the gladiators, as slaves, as entertainers, could rally the public in a way the Roman Senate could not. The gladiators weren't just slaves, they were icons of resistance. It's almost ironic that Rome's own entertainment, its shining example of power, became the very vehicle for undermining that power. Gladiator rebellions were not just bloody fights, they were a response to an empire that wielded its power in every corner of life. While Rome used the games to keep the population entertained and distracted, the gladiators showed the people that even in the most oppressed of circumstances, defiance was possible. The more successful these rebellions were, the more the empire realized that this entertainment wasn't just a show, it was a symbol. And every time a gladiator won their fight for freedom, the cracks in Rome's facade became more evident. The gladiatorial games were not only a display of Roman supremacy, they were a reflection of the empire's values that were rooted in violence, domination, and spectacle. It was a system that fed itself, using the bloodshed of the arena to keep people in check. But the gladiators were beginning to show the Roman people a different story, a story of defiance, a story of resistance. Some gladiators, like Spartacus, rose to become legends not just for their victories in the arena, but because their rebellion shook the very foundations of Rome's control. The gladiatorial system exposed deep contradictions within Roman society. The games were meant to showcase Roman power, yet in doing so, they gave rise to challenges that threatened the empire's reputation. Gladiators, though forced into brutal conditions, had a surprising amount of agency when they began to fight for freedom. And as the rebellions grew, so did the realization that the games weren't just about entertainment. They were a reflection of Rome's fragile grip on power. As one gladiator after another defied their fate, Rome's grand facade of control started to crack. What makes this all even more surprising is how the gladiatorial games were a means of political manipulation, yet they were also a window into Rome's deeper issues. The games were used to maintain the status quo, to placate the people. But as gladiators rose up, the people began to see their rebellion as more than just an act of violence. It became a symbol of resistance, and perhaps more importantly, a symbol of a Rome that was beginning to lose control. And this, what was once a symbol of Roman might, turned into a reminder of its fragility. Rome's elite used the games as a political tool, showcasing their wealth and influence to gain favor with the people. But the gladiators, who were forced to fight for entertainment, were able to tap into this power and turn it against the empire. As the gladiators won battles and rose up against their masters, they became not just rebels, they became a mirror, reflecting the flaws in the empire's control over its people. Their rebellion wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a challenge to the entire Roman power structure. The gladiatorial games were not only a way for Rome to showcase its might, but when the gladiators fought back, they revealed the true nature of Roman control. It was fragile, it was brittle, and it could be easily shaken. The games became a symbol of what Rome was willing to do to maintain its power, but also a symbol of what could happen when that power was challenged. And that's what makes the gladiators' rebellion so important. They weren't just about fighting for freedom, they were about undermining the very system that used them as pawns. Gladiators, once enslaved and bound by the empire, became symbols of defiance, showing the world that even the most oppressed could fight back. Through their rebellion, the gladiators revealed the cracks in the mighty Roman Empire, forcing the people of Rome to confront the true cost of their power. Gladiators weren't just fighting for survival, they were symbolizing something much larger, challenging the very structure of Roman society. You might think of gladiators as just slaves, bound to fight in the arena for the entertainment of the public. But in reality, being a gladiator meant much more than that. These fighters weren't simply trained to fight, they were trained to survive in a system that sought to dehumanize them. Yet, over time, gladiators began to embody a resistance that was bigger than the arenas. When gladiators entered the Galudi, the brutal schools where they were trained, they didn't just learn combat skills, they learned how to work as a team, how to survive in a system designed to crush them. The Galudi were grueling, with rigorous training that turned men into warriors, but they also became places where bonds were formed. Gladiators came to rely on each other for survival, and this camaraderie played a key role in the eventual rebellions. These men were not fighting just for freedom, they were fighting for their dignity, and in some cases for a sense of brotherhood that transcended the empire's power. Unsurprising fact about gladiators is that many were former soldiers who had been captured or enslaved. These men had once fought for Rome, yet they found themselves reduced to tools of entertainment in the very system they had served. This creates a strange paradox. Gladiators, once proud warriors defending Rome, now forced to fight for their survival in front of thousands. But this transformation didn't erase their military experience. In fact, it made them formidable adversaries. When they rose up, they were not only fighting to escape their masters, they were fighting with tactics and discipline that made them a serious threat. What is even more surprising is the role that gladiators came to play in Roman society. They weren't just viewed as entertainment, they were symbols of resistance. Gladiators, despite being enslaved and oppressed, began to influence public opinion. The very act of fighting for survival in the arena became a symbol of strength and courage. In some cases, gladiators achieved fame that surpassed even that of Roman soldiers or political figures. They became celebrities, symbols of power, defiance, and sometimes rebellion. Their fame, however, wasn't just about personal glory, it was about the public's perception of them as figures, and as their popularity grew, so did their ability to challenge the empire. The gladiatorial games were meant to showcase Rome's power, but as more and more gladiators gained notoriety, the games began to reveal the cracks in Rome's control. Gladiators became a reflection of the empire's greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. One of the most important lessons from the story of gladiators is that their fight wasn't just physical, it was ideological. Gladiators weren't just fighting for freedom from their masters, they were challenging the very system that oppressed them. Their rebellion wasn't just about escaping the arena, it was about undermining the empire's entire social structure. Gladiators, once seen as the lowest of the low, became the symbols of resistance that revealed the true nature of Roman society. Their struggle was not only for personal freedom, but for something larger, a fight to change the very system that kept them oppressed. In many ways, gladiators were challenging the idea of Roman superiority itself. They were confronting a society that saw them as mere objects of entertainment, a society that used their lives for spectacle. When gladiators rose up, they were no longer just fighting for survival, they were fighting for justice, for the idea that even the most oppressed could rise against the powerful. This idea of gladiators as symbols of defiance may be controversial. After all, many people think of them as mere entertainers, fighting for the amusement of the masses. But the reality is far more complex. Gladiators were warriors in every sense of the word. They fought in the arena, yes, but they also fought for their humanity. And when they turned that fight against the empire, it wasn't just about bloodshed, it was about the very principles that the empire was built upon. The gladiatorial games, designed to showcase Rome's dominance, began to expose the flaws in that system. Here's a rare fact: gladiators were often seen as a way to maintain control over the Roman masses. The games were a form of political theater, used by the elites to distract and control the people. But as gladiators gained more fame and their rebellions grew stronger, the games began to lose their power to control. The gladiators, once symbols of Rome's might, were now symbols of its weakness. Every rebellion, every act of defiance in the arena, chipped away at the empire's image of invincibility. And what's even more fascinating is how some gladiators used their public influence to challenge the system from within. In the arena, they had to fight for their lives, but outside the arena, they became symbols of rebellion that threatened the very foundation of Roman society. Gladiators weren't just pawns in a game. They were warriors, rebels, and icons of resistance. They embodied the struggle for freedom, for justice, and for the power to stand up to the empire that had enslaved them. It's not just about survival, it's about the bigger picture. Gladiators were part of a larger story, one that was about more than just a fight in the arena. It was about challenging the very structure of Roman society. The gladiatorial games, meant to display Rome's power, became a mirror of the empire's fragility. Gladiators, once reduced to mere tools of entertainment, became the warriors who threatened the very fabric of Roman rule. In the end, their rebellion wasn't just a fight for freedom, it was a fight for the future of Rome itself. The gladiators' struggle was not just about their own survival, it was about challenging the empire's power and revealing the cracks in its foundation. The story of the gladiators is a powerful reminder that even in the most oppressive systems, the human spirit can fight back. And through their bravery, their struggle, and their defiance, the gladiators became the unexpected heroes of Roman history. Gladiators weren't just fighting for their lives, they were challenging the very structure of Roman society. But what does it mean to truly be a gladiator? Most people picture them as mere pawns in the grand spectacle of Rome, fighting for their lives in the arena. But there was so much more to it. Behind every gladiator was a story of survival, survival, camaraderie. Gladiators were trained in the telugi, a brutal world where the fight to the death was just a part of their daily routine. In these sludi, gladiators weren't simply trained to be brutal fighters. They were taught to survive, and in some cases to thrive in an oppressive system. They were forced into this life, but that didn't mean they were powerless. The harsh training conditions and grueling fights helped forge them into some of the fiercest fighters in the empire. They were warriors by necessity, yet many of them began to form bonds with one another, seeing in each other not just competition, but the potential for resistance. What's even more surprising is that not all gladiators were enslaved. Many actually volunteered for the chance at fame and glory. They knew that in Rome, the gladiatorial games were more than just blood sport. They were a stepping stone to personal power. Those who survived the games could gain immense status, with some even achieving wealth and recognition. The paradox is striking. These men were slaves to the empire's power, but they could also rise to the top of its social pyramid. Truth is, gladiatorial combat wasn't simply a form of entertainment. It was a tool of control. Rome used the games to display its power, to keep the public entertained, and to remind the masses of the might of the empire. But as the gladiators fought for their lives, they inadvertently revealed cracks in this carefully crafted illusion of Roman invincibility. They became symbols of defiance, and over time, some gladiators fought for freedom, seeking to escape the system that bound them. Others fought to become champions, striving for a place in the Roman elite. But as rebellions began to take shape, these men weren't simply fighting for survival. They were fighting for something greater. They were challenging Rome's dominance, its very social structure, and the system that saw them as expendable. And here's a fact that might surprise you. Gladiators weren't just fighting for survival in the arena. They were challenging the very idea of Roman superiority. Gladiators, once seen as the lowest of the low, became the symbols of resistance against an oppressive empire. The gladiatorial games, originally created to maintain control, began to highlight the empire's weaknesses. Gladiators, despite being forced into brutal combat, became symbols of hope for the oppressed. Heroes who dared to stand up against an empire that thought it was invincible. What's even more surprising is that some gladiators fought alongside one another in ways that transcended mere survival. In many cases, their shared experiences forged bonds that were stronger than the chains that bound them. Gladiators came to view one another as brothers, united by the common enemy, the Roman elite. This sense of unity was critical when rebellions broke out. Gladiators were no longer just victims of the system. They were warriors, fighting not just for freedom, but for justice. The strange part, the very system that sought to oppress them gave gladiators the platform to rise up. Through the arena, gladiators gained the attention of the masses. Their bravery, skill, and tenacity made them into public icons. But rather than using their fame to become loyal servants of Rome, many gladiators used it as a stepping stone to challenge the empire itself. The arena, once a tool of control, became a battleground for freedom. Some people may argue that gladiators were simply fighting for their lives, that their rebellions were just the result of desperation. But the reality is far more complex. Gladiators were symbolizing something much larger than just a fight for survival. They represented the power of resistance, the idea that even the most oppressed could challenge the mighty empire that enslaved them. The gladiators' rebellion wasn't just about winning battles. It was about challenging an unjust system. As time went on, the gladiator rebellions exposed deeper cracks in Roman society. Gladiators, seen as disposable objects of entertainment, began to reshape the public's perception of what it meant to be a slave in Rome. Their bravery, their fights, and their very existence forced Rome to confront uncomfortable truths about its own power. It became clear that the system that kept gladiators chained to the arena was not as stable as the empire's rulers would have liked to believe. Here's an interesting fact you might not know. Gladiators were often viewed as a reflection of Roman power, a symbol of the empire's dominance. But as the gladiators gained popularity and began to fight back, the games started to symbolize the empire's flaws. The games, meant to control the public, started to reveal how fragile the Roman system really was. In the end, the gladiators weren't just challenging their own fate, they were challenging the entire empire. Their story is one of defiance, one that teaches us the power of unity and resistance. Gladiators showed us that even in the most brutal of circumstances, the human spirit can fight back against the forces that seek to oppress it. They were more than just warriors. They were symbols of rebellion, of the idea that no matter how high the walls around you, no matter how strong the chains that bind you, there is always a chance to rise and fight for your freedom. Gladiator rebellions were not only about escaping death in the arena, but symbolized a far larger fight against the very system that enslaved them. Or, with all its grandeur, relied on its military might, politics, and especially its gladiatorial games to maintain control. But what happens when the very symbol of Roman dominance, the gladiator, becomes the symbol of resistance? This was the reality for Emperor Macrinus, whose reign was rocked by gladiator uprisings that not only challenged his authority, but exposed the cracks in Rome's power structure. Macrinus, who rose to power through political maneuvering rather than family legacy, had already started on shaky ground with the Roman elite. The short reign he held was fraught with challenges, and his inability to gain the full support of the military or align with the traditional Roman powers eventually led to his downfall. The gladiator rebellions came at a time when Macrinus was already under siege. His regime was struggling with loyalty issues, and the gladiator uprisings were a pivotal factor factor that caused his downfall. These revolts were a direct challenge to Roman authority. He could not suppress them without weakening his own political position. While many people associate gladiator uprisings with famous figures like Spartacus, there were many others, including smaller rebellions, which highlighted the simmering discontent among the gladiator class. These men, often former soldiers or criminals, turned into trained gladiators, were no longer merely pawns in the empire's grand spectacle. They had become warriors, emboldened by the idea of freedom, and the gladiator games, intended to entertain, became the backdrop for resistance. But here's the twist. Not all gladiators were united in their cause. Some were fighting for vengeance against those who had wronged them, while others saw the rebellion as a chance to dismantle the Roman Empire's oppressive system. For Macrinus, dealing with these uprisings became increasingly difficult. The military, which was supposed to quell such rebellions, was not as united as it appeared. Some soldiers were former gladiators themselves, and others sympathized with the gladiators' plight. This added complexity to the situation. While Roman soldiers were tasked with crushing the revolts, some found themselves questioning the morality of such actions. Some even began to quietly support the gladiators. As these uprisings spread, they revealed a deeper issue, a lack of unity and loyalty within the Roman military and government. This struggle over control wasn't just physical, it was political, threatening to expose the instability of Rome's rules. But it wasn't just about quelling an uprising, it was about managing an entire public relations nightmare. Gladiator rebellions were a slap in the face to the Roman elite, exposing their power as brittle, their grip on control tenuous. The games, once a symbol of Roman power and the empire's dominance over its subjects, were no longer just a spectacle for the masses. They had become a stage for defiance, and the gladiators weren't just fighting for their own lives, they were fighting to change the social order. Macrinus found himself in an impossible situation. How does one govern an empire where those who were meant to be controlled are rising up, challenging both the public and the military's loyalty? These uprisings were pivotal in weakening Macrinus's hold on power. As the gladiators grew bolder, challenging the empire's very foundation, the emperor struggled to manage the unrest. Rome was no longer the invincible empire it claimed to be. While Macrinus attempted to contain the uprisings, he lacked the political and military alliances necessary to suppress the rebellion effectively. His attempts were inconsistent, and key military leaders began questioning his leadership. As rebellions grew stronger and the gladiators gained more ground, Macrinus found himself in a losing battle. The very gladiators he once saw as tools for control had become his undoing, and his inability to control them would lead to his assassination. The gladiators, once seen as mere pawns in Rome's game, had now become symbols of resistance. But here's the thing. Their fight wasn't just for personal freedom. It was about challenging the structure of Roman society itself. By understanding the struggles and challenges of the gladiators, you can see how their rebellions played a significant role in shaping the political landscape of Rome. They weren't just fighting for their own survival, they were fighting to dismantle the very system that enslaved them. It was an epic struggle that revealed the fragility of Rome's power and the shifting loyalties within its military and political spheres. The gladiator uprisings ultimately led to the downfall of Macrinus and further exposed the weaknesses of an empire that prided itself on its invincibility. It's often easy to dismiss the gladiators as mere slaves, but in reality their uprisings had much deeper political ramifications. Their revolts were a direct challenge to the power structure of Rome itself. In fact, without their rebellions, Rome might not have realized just how precarious its grip on power was. The gladiators exposed the cracks in Rome's system, forcing the elite to confront the limitations of their control. The very act of rebellion by those who were once seen as nothing more than tools for entertainment became a catalyst for broader political change. In the end, the gladiator rebellions during Macrinus's reign were more than just struggles for survival in the arena. They were challenges to the foundation of Roman society, forcing Rome's leaders to confront the fragility of their own power. Gladiators had once been viewed as expendable, but their rise to rebellion proved that even the oppressed could challenge the most powerful empire in the world. The downfall of Macrinus, in part, is a testament to the power of these rebellions and the potential for change that they sparked. The unexpected alliances between gladiators and powerful figures in Rome might surprise you. We often think of Rome as a strict hierarchical society where rebellion was an isolated effort, yet the gladiators found help in places you wouldn't expect. Though these men were often the lowest of the low, slaves, criminals, and prisoners, when they rose against their masters, they did not do so alone. Behind the bloody battles, alliances were being forged, and some of the most influential Romans of the time secretly sympathized with their cause. It's hard to imagine that Roman military commanders, senators, and even some of the elites would align themselves with the very men they controlled, but that's exactly what happened. While the Roman Empire portrayed its strength and control in the arena, gladiators weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for something much larger, freedom. But could they have succeeded without help from within the empire? The reality is that some Roman military leaders, who saw the gladiators as brave warriors rather than mere slaves, quietly supported their fight. These military figures knew better than anyone that Rome's reliance on slaves, gladiators included, was part of a fragile system. The gladiators, being trained soldiers in their own right, became a symbol symbol of rebellion against a system that had been built on oppression and violence. These unexpected alliances were critical in giving the gladiators a fighting chance, but these alliances weren't always overt. Gladiators, by their very nature, could not afford to trust too easily. Many of their supporters hid in the shadows, fearful of reprisal from the emperor and the Senate. Still, the sheer force of the gladiators' resistance stirred unease in the Roman elite. Some senators saw the gladiators' actions as a sign of systemic problems within Rome, a massive empire built on the backs of slaves that could crumble if enough people pushed back. What makes these alliances even more fascinating is the fact that many of the gladiators' supporters genuinely believed that they could offer better leadership than the emperors themselves. The gladiators weren't simply fighting to escape the arena, they were challenging the very foundation of Rome's imperial system. Some of their supporters viewed them as heroes, fighting not just for their own freedom, but for a revolution that could upend the social order. What's perhaps the most surprising is the extent to which these alliances affected the course of the gladiator rebellions. Were these influential figures the key to the gladiators' initial successes? It's possible. The backing from some in the military and political spheres gave the gladiators a new level of strategic advantage. These alliances added a layer of complexity to what might have otherwise been seen as just a fight for freedom in the arena. The gladiators weren't just pawns, they were the catalysts of a much larger revolution. Yet, as with many revolutions, this support wasn't enough to guarantee success. The power dynamics of Rome were immense, and even with their allies, the gladiators faced overwhelming odds. But their fight forced the Roman Empire to confront the weaknesses in its own structure. Their bravery and rebellion, bolstered by these unexpected allies, highlighted the deep cracks in Rome's dominance and left a lasting mark on the empire. One of the most interesting facts about these alliances is that they weren't limited to the military or political elites. Some of the most powerful figures in Rome were wealthy and influential individuals who quietly helped fund the gladiators' fight for freedom. They provided resources, tactical support, and, in some cases, even refuge. This support came at great personal risk, and many of these figures never publicly aligned themselves with the gladiators, fearing for their own safety. Their quiet but crucial contributions suggest that, even in a society as rigid and brutal as ancient Rome, pockets of sympathy for the oppressed existed at the highest levels. What does this mean for our understanding of Roman society? It shows that the empire was not a monolith. While it was undoubtedly oppressive, there were those within it who saw the cracks in its foundation and took risks to support the fight for freedom. The gladiators may have been enslaved and forced into combat, but their resistance inspired some of the most powerful figures in Rome to question the empire's methods and to offer support in clandestine ways. This gives us a rare and unique insight into the complexities of Roman power. Gladiator rebellions weren't just about the warriors in the arena. They were the focal point of a much larger conversation about power, oppression, and the potential for change within one of the most powerful empires in history. The alliances forged between gladiators and influential Romans didn't just help the gladiators survive, they helped fuel the flames of a revolution that would shake the very foundation of Rome's imperial system. It's also important to remember that these alliances were never without their risks. The consequences of being caught sympathizing with the gladiators were severe. Executions were common for those who opposed the state, and yet these alliances still existed. Why? Because for some, the injustice of the gladiators' plight was undeniable. They could see the way the gladiators were being exploited, and perhaps in a world where the lines between slave and master could be so easily blurred, they could see themselves in the gladiators' struggle. By the end of this chapter, we see how even the most unlikely figures in Rome were not just bystanders to the gladiator rebellions. They were active participants, contributing in ways that would ensure the survival of the gladiators' fight for. These unexpected alliances played a crucial role in the early successes of the gladiator revolts, making their ultimate failure even more tragic and the cost of their resistance even higher. The gladiators' final stand was not just a battle for survival, it was a symbol of their defiance against the system that had enslaved them. When we think of gladiators, we often think of Spartacus, the leader of the most famous rebellion, but the story of gladiators is filled with lesser-known figures, some just as extraordinary, who fought with the same courage and conviction. These leaders, often overlooked in history, were just as much symbols of resistance as Spartacus, and their fates were as dramatic as their fights. The final acts of these gladiators were not just physical struggles, they were ideological. These men had become more than just fighters in the arena. They had become symbols of resistance against the empire itself. Some of these gladiators, like Spartacus, died fighting for freedom, but the struggle of the rebellion did not end with them. Others faced a tragic fate, as the Roman Empire, relentless in its control, found ways to suppress their uprisings. These gladiators left behind a legacy of defiance that reverberated through time. In the midst of the fighting, there was also a sense of hope. Some of the gladiators who fought in the rebellion found themselves trapped in the very system they sought to destroy. They had risen to positions of leadership, but in the end, they were trapped by the very powers they had fought against. It was a bitter irony. They had become what they despised. Yet, despite this, their final acts of resistance were not in vain. They fought until the very end, inspiring future generations to fight for freedom in ways they could never have imagined. While we remember Spartacus and the larger rebellion, it's important to note the other gladiators who led their own revolts and whose stories stories remain largely untold. Some were trapped in the same cycle of violence, fighting for their lives until the bitter end. Others made their stand in the face of overwhelming odds, giving everything they had for a cause greater than themselves. It's this courage, this unwavering determination, that marks them as true symbols of resistance. Their actions exposed the cracks in the Roman Empire's control over its people, shaking the foundations of the empire itself. Their fight for freedom was not just a struggle against the cruelty of the arena. It was a challenge to the very structure of Roman society, an institution that relied on oppression and violence to maintain power. As the rebellions grew in strength, the Roman Empire began to feel the pressure. The gladiators weren't just fighting for their lives, they were fighting for a larger cause. They were fighting against a system that had been built on the backs of slaves, using them as tools for entertainment and political power. The rebellion wasn't just about the gladiators, it was about exposing the brutal reality of the empire's hold over its people. The Roman response to the rebellion was swift and brutal. In its attempt to maintain control, resorted to extreme measures. Gladiators who were captured were often executed, their bodies left on display as a reminder of the empire's power. But despite the physical defeat of these gladiators, their ideological victory lived on. They had forced Rome to confront the limits of its power and the fragility of the system it had built. While their bodies may have been broken, the spirit of resistance that they embodied could not be erased. Their acts of defiance, their refusal to submit, left an indelible mark on history. And as we look back on their struggle, we see that their fight for freedom was not in vain. The gladiators who rose up against Rome, no matter how tragic their fates, changed the course of history. We remember the legacy of Spartacus and his followers, but we must also honor the memory of the gladiators who fought for the same cause and whose names may never be known. Their resistance against the empire became a symbol of hope for the oppressed, and it reminds us that even in the darkest of times, there is always the potential for defiance and change. Their final stand was more than just a fight for freedom. It was a fight for the soul of Rome itself. Gladiator rebellions, while often remembered for their violence and brutality, had a profound impact on the Roman Empire. These uprisings, though sometimes overshadowed by the larger historical narrative of Rome's military might, were more than mere acts of defiance. They were symbolic battles against the very structure of the Roman world. But what was the true impact of these gladiator rebellions on Rome? How did these revolts shape the empire, and what did they reveal about Roman society itself? First, let's acknowledge that gladiator rebellions were not just mere insurrections, but strikes at the core of the Roman power structure. The empire was built on an intricate system of control, and the gladiatorial games played a crucial role in maintaining this system. Gladiators were not just fighters for entertainment, they were political symbols, pawns used by the elites to reinforce their dominance. But when these same gladiators rose up, they exposed the vulnerability of that system. It wasn't just the physical might of Rome that was being challenged, it was the very foundation of Roman society itself. The gladiators' rebellion had a ripple effect. It wasn't just about breaking free from the shackles of their chains, it was a rejection of a social order that relied on brutality to maintain peace. This was not lost on the Roman public, who, despite being entertained by the bloodshed, began to see a different narrative unfolding. These uprisings forced Romans to confront their treatment of slaves and the cost of their empire. It raised uncomfortable questions about the empire's reliance on violence, not just in the arena but in every aspect of governance. One of the most significant ways that gladiator rebellions impacted Rome was in the realm of public opinion. Gladiators, often perceived as mere animals in the eyes of Roman elites, became symbols of resistance and courage. Their struggle began to resonate beyond the confines of the arena, affecting how the general populace viewed their rulers. These were no longer just slaves fighting for their lives. They were heroes, rebels, and in some cases political leaders who stood against oppression. The public, who had once been passive spectators to the violence in the arena, began to see the gladiators as something more, as victims of a corrupt and failing system. Now consider how these uprisings challenged Roman authority. Empire, built on its military prowess, was now being undermined by those who were once considered the lowest of the low. The gladiators were not only taking up arms against their masters, but they were also challenging the Roman identity itself. For centuries, Rome had prided itself on being a society where strength and dominance reigned. Yet when faced with the rebellion of men who were supposed to be broken and subjugated, it became clear that Rome's strength was not as invincible as it had once seemed. The emperor's role, particularly during the reign of Macrinus, became pivotal in dealing with these revolts. Macrinus, who rose to power through political maneuvering rather than military conquest, found himself caught between the demands of the ruling elites and the growing discontent of the lower classes. Gladiator rebellions were not isolated events, they were part of a larger tide of unrest. And as the rebellions grew in scale, Macrinus struggled to maintain control, ultimately revealing the cracks in Roman governance. But the gladiators' rebellion did not just weaken the empire, it left a lasting legacy on Roman policy. Treatment of slaves, the relationship between the military and the political elite, and even the public's perception of their rulers were all altered by these uprisings. Gladiator rebellions pushed the empire to confront uncomfortable truths about itself. While Rome might have been able to suppress the violence with force, it couldn't erase the questions that these rebellions raised. The gladiators had, in a sense, won, because because they had forced Rome to reckon with its own power. In the end, gladiator rebellions mattered to Rome because they were not just a fight for freedom, they were a reckoning with the empire's identity. These rebellions exposed the fragility of Roman control and shifted the way Romans viewed their rulers. The gladiators' final acts of defiance became a symbol of resistance that transcended their time, influencing not just the fate of the empire but also the broader concept of oppression and rebellion throughout history. The real victory of the gladiators was not in their brief moments of rebellion, it was in the lasting legacy of their resistance. The gladiator rebellions were not just about a fight for survival, they were deeply entrenched in the power dynamics and structure of Roman society. These rebellions forced the empire to confront its vulnerability, ultimately leading to shifts in the political landscape. The rebellion of the gladiators was not just about breaking free from their shackles, it was about disrupting the very foundation of Rome's dominance. They pushed the boundaries of the empire's control, revealing cracks in its systems that had long been hidden from view. These rebellions, especially those led by figures like Spartacus, were more than just a series of uprisings. They were acts of defiance against a system that thrived on oppression. Gladiators were not simply fighters in an arena, they were symbols of Rome's broader issues. The Roman elite, who orchestrated the games as a way to display their wealth and power, had inadvertently created a situation where the very system they relied on to maintain control was now the target of those who had been subjugated. The impact of the gladiator rebellions was not just felt in the immediate conflicts, they exposed the limits of Roman power and authority. The revolt was not just about breaking the chains of slavery, it was a challenge to the oppressive social hierarchy that divided Rome. Gladiator uprisings made it impossible for the elite to ignore the larger social tensions that were brewing. For Rome, this wasn't just about losing control of a few slaves, it was about the unraveling of a deeply entrenched system of control that had held the empire together for centuries. By forcing the empire to face these uncomfortable truths, gladiator rebellions had a lasting effect on Roman society. The public, once passive participants in the gladiatorial games, began to question the very fabric of the empire. The brutal spectacles that were meant to demonstrate Rome's power and control started to reveal the cracks beneath the surface. This challenge to the authority of Rome also led to shifts in Roman policies regarding slavery and military service. What made these rebellions so impactful was not just their ability to challenge Rome's physical power, but their ability to expose a deeper crisis in Roman values. The gladiators were not just fighting for their own survival, they were fighting to redefine what it meant to be a Roman. Their uprisings were a rejection of the very system that had been used to control them, and in doing so, they forced the empire to confront its own weaknesses, prompting a shift in how Rome governed and how its rulers were perceived. In the end, gladiator rebellions weren't just about the struggle for freedom, they were about challenging the foundation of Roman society itself. These uprisings highlighted the fragility of the empire and laid the groundwork for changes in how Roman authorities would govern. They weren't just slave revolts, they were revolutionary movements that altered the course of Roman history. The legacy of these rebellions lives on in the way we think about power, resistance, and the fight for freedom. The story of the gladiators reminds us that even the most oppressed can disrupt the most powerful systems, and in doing so, change the course of history. Gladiator rebellions were more than just isolated uprisings against an oppressive system. They were profound acts of defiance that illuminated the cracks within Rome's imperial power. What makes these revolts so significant is that they forced Roman authorities to reckon with their own vulnerability. They weren't just slave revolts, they were challenges to the very core of Roman authority, revealing deep-seated issues with the empire structure. The gladiators, once considered disposable by the Roman elite, became symbols of resistance. They fought not just for survival, but to challenge a deeply ingrained system of oppression. They questioned the moral foundation of an empire that built its wealth on violence, control, and submission. Through their rebellion, they exposed a reality that the Roman elite could no longer ignore. Their power was not as unshakable as they believed. These uprisings represented a broader critique of Rome's social hierarchies, laying bare the injustices experienced by not just the gladiators, but the lower classes as a whole. Rome's reaction to these uprisings was critical. The rebellion exposed just how fragile the empire's control over its provinces and its military forces really were. Some of the most well-known figures in Roman history, like Spartacus, are often seen as the face of this resistance. Others who rose up alongside him, Crixus, Gannicus, and even lesser-known figures, represented a wide spectrum of gladiators who fought for their own vision of freedom, whether that was revenge against their masters or a broader political revolution against Rome's power structure. Their rebellion was about much more than gaining personal freedom. It was about rejecting the empire's exploitation and offering an alternative vision. The gladiator rebellions forced Rome to reflect on its treatment of slaves and military personnel. While the elite were busy thinking of ways to restore control, the public began to question the moral costs of the empire's spectacles. The gladiators, despite being slaves, commanded the admiration of many Romans who were shocked to see such powerful figures rise up against the very system that oppressed them. This shift in perception was critical. It caused Rome's elite to begin changing their approach to the treatment of both slaves and soldiers, ultimately influencing policies around military service, slavery, and even public entertainment. But the story doesn't end with the fall of individual gladiators. The rebellions they ignited pushed forward a a more enduring lesson. They demonstrated the power of collective action, the courage to defy oppressive systems, and the potential for change, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The rebellion of the gladiators and their tragic fates left a lasting legacy that would ripple through Roman history. Even today, the story of these gladiators offers valuable lessons. Their struggles for freedom continue to resonate with those who face oppression around the world. By understanding these rebellions, we can draw parallels to modern movements, realizing that resistance, no matter how small, can challenge and change the systems that bind us. The gladiators' fight wasn't just a historical anomaly, it was a moment of defiance that continues to inspire those who seek justice and freedom in the present day. Their final stand was not just about breaking chains, it was about breaking an entire system that dehumanized them and countless others. The impact of the gladiator rebellions on Roman society goes beyond just the immediate aftermath. These revolts marked a critical point in Rome's history, one that forced both the elite and the general public to reconsider their views on power, resistance, and social justice. The lessons they left behind are as relevant today as they were in ancient Rome. What if I told you that the gladiator rebellions weren't just about fighting for freedom? They were a direct challenge to the power and stability of Rome itself. Imagine the roar of the crowd, the blood in the arena, and the desperation of those forced to fight for their lives. But behind that fight, there was more at play. These were not just slave uprisings. They were defiant acts that revealed deep cracks within the Roman Empire's foundation. The gladiators weren't only fighting to survive, they were fighting to shake the very system that enslaved them. Let's start by diving deep into one of the most intriguing parts of these rebellions, the gladiators themselves. They were often portrayed as mere pawns in the games, destined for bloodshed and death. But was that all they were? The answer may surprise you. Gladiators were not just victims, they were often highly trained warriors, strategically maneuvering for freedom in a world where every battle could be their last. Some gladiators volunteered for the arena, lured by the promise of fame, fortune, or the hope of a better life. However, it wasn't just about fighting for survival. These fighters could rise to unimaginable heights, gaining wealth, recognition, and a kind of freedom that others could only dream of. But for many, these victories weren't enough. After enduring brutal training and savage combat, some gladiators began to dream of something far bigger than personal glory, freedom from Rome's tyranny. This desire for freedom led to uprisings that shocked the empire. The most famous of these rebellions, led by Spartacus, became the stuff of legend. But what if I told you that this rebellion wasn't the only one? Other gladiators, like Crixus and the smaller uprisings, played equally dramatic roles in challenging the Roman system. These rebellions weren't just about striking back at their captors. They were symbolic of a deeper resistance to the entire Roman power structure. What does it say about a system when the very people who were supposed to be its weakest and most oppressed could rise up and challenge its rule? These gladiator-led uprisings were not just bloody revolts. They were attacks on the heart of Roman society, a call to question the empire's very foundations. But where do emperors like Macrinus fit into this? How did his reign, which lasted only a few years, intersect with these gladiator rebellions? Macrinus' rule was not marked by the usual lines of succession. His path to the throne was forged through cunning political maneuvering, making him a controversial figure in Roman history. As emperor, his decisions, including those involving the military and gladiators, were often seen as weak or inconsistent. When gladiators rose up, Macrinus found himself facing not just a military challenge, but a deeper societal crisis that he could not resolve. The uprisings exposed his lack of control, and eventually, they played a crucial role in his downfall. You may think that the Roman military was united in crushing these rebellions, but that was far from the truth. The soldiers tasked with putting down these revolts were not always as loyal or as committed as one might expect. In fact, some Roman soldiers had once been in the very same position as the gladiators, fighting for their lives, seeking freedom in the ranks. When the gladiators rebelled, some soldiers even sympathized with them, complicating the Roman military's ability to quickly squash the uprisings. This complex relationship between the gladiators and the military further deepened the conflict, making it a struggle not just for freedom, but for the future of the empire itself. But why were these gladiator rebellions so important to Rome? What did they reveal about the empire that was so unsettling? These revolts forced Rome to confront the limitations of its control over its vast empire. The cracks in Roman society became more visible as the gladiators, in their fight for freedom, showed just how vulnerable the empire's structure really was. Roman authorities had to face the uncomfortable reality that their empire was built on a system of oppression and exploitation, one that could be undone by those very same people. The gladiators' challenge wasn't just to the emperor, it was to every Roman who benefited from that system. As we look at how these rebellions impacted the Roman worldview, we must also recognize their lasting legacy. The gladiators, once slaves and tools for public entertainment, became symbols of resistance. Their actions forced the Roman elite to reconsider their approach to military service, slavery, and power. What's more, the gladiators' struggles have continued to inspire countless freedom fighters across the world. Their rebellion wasn't just about survival, it was about changing the course of history. Even today, the lessons learned from their defiance resonate with those fighting for justice, equality, and the right to be free from oppression. The gladiator rebellions were a powerful reminder that no matter how entrenched an oppressive system system may seem. Resistance can ignite change. The gladiators may have fought for their own survival, but in doing so, they created a ripple effect that would forever alter the way Romans saw their empire and themselves. Their story is one of tragedy, courage, and defiance. It's a story that, despite being centuries old, still offers important lessons for us today about the power of resistance and the fight for freedom. What if I told you that the gladiator rebellions were not just about survival, but a direct assault on the very fabric of Roman power? Gladiators, those slaves forced to fight for their lives in brutal arenas, were not just fighting for their own freedom. They were fighting for something much greater, the very system that enslaved them. But here's where it gets complicated. The gladiator uprisings were not just about bloodshed. They were about revealing the vulnerability of the most powerful empire the world had ever known. And in the process, they raised questions that would haunt Rome for centuries. Imagine a system built on absolute control, a system that thought it was invincible. Gladiators, once seen as mere pawns, became the symbol of resistance, striking at the core of Roman authority. But why did their rebellions matter to Rome so much? The answer isn't just in the chaos they caused, or the blood they spilled. It's in the deeper cracks they exposed within Roman society, cracks that even the powerful Emperor Macrinus couldn't ignore. His reign, short as it was, became a battleground not just for political control, but for the very future of Rome itself. In this video, we will unravel the complex story of these gladiator-led uprisings. We'll explore the surprising alliances, the unexpected figures who sympathized with the gladiators, and the tragic fates of those who sought freedom. And at the heart of it all, we'll dive deep into why these revolts weren't just about fighting for life. They were a defiant stand against Rome's overwhelming power. Now, let's begin by looking at one of the most intriguing aspects of these rebellions: who the gladiators were, and why they weren't just victims, but warriors. Many gladiators were slaves, but not all. Some volunteered for the arena, drawn by the allure of fame, fortune, and the hope of changing their destinies. They were trained in brutal conditions, forged into some of the fiercest warriors in the empire. But as their training grew harsher, so did their desire to escape the system they had been forced into. While some sought freedom through rebellion, others simply fought to gain their status, to become champions in the eyes of the people. But here's a surprising truth. Gladiators weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting to challenge the very structure of Roman society. Gladiatorial combat was more than just bloodshed for entertainment. It was a tool of control, a way to maintain power over the masses. Gladiators, despite their status as slaves, could rise to remarkable levels of influence. Victory in the arena could grant them wealth and fame, and sometimes even their freedom. But for others, that freedom would come only through revolt. This brings us to one of the most famous gladiator uprisings in history, the rebellion led by Spartacus. But what if I told you Spartacus wasn't the only gladiator to rise up? In fact, there were many rebellions, some led by gladiators like Crixus, smaller uprisings that were equally important, yet largely forgotten. These uprisings weren't just acts of rebellion. They were an assault on the Roman power structure itself. And what's fascinating is that not all of these gladiators were fighting for the same thing. While Spartacus sought to free his fellow slaves, others, like Crixus, fought more out of personal revenge against the system that had enslaved them. But all of them shared one thing in common. They were fighting for freedom, not just for themselves, but for a system that was breaking apart under the weight of its own corruption. In this context, we turn our attention to the emperor at the time, Macrinus. He wasn't supposed to be emperor. He didn't come from royal blood, and his rise to power wasn't through military conquest or the will of the Roman people. Instead, Macrinus maneuvered his way into the throne through political intrigue. His reign, though brief, was filled with chaos and challenges that he couldn't overcome. One of the most significant challenges was the rise of gladiator-led uprisings. These rebellions threatened the stability of the empire, but they also exposed the cracks in its foundations, cracks that Macrinus couldn't fix. The Roman army, which was meant to preserve order and quell uprisings, became an unexpected player in these rebellions. Some soldiers who were tasked with suppressing the revolts had once been in the gladiators' shoes. This made them more sympathetic to the cause of the gladiators, which created a moral dilemma. How could soldiers, trained to maintain control, fight against people who were, in some ways, fighting for their own freedom? But there's more to the story than just blood and rebellion. The gladiatorial games weren't just entertainment. They were a reflection of Roman power. The games were used by the elite to display their wealth, their status, and their control over the lower classes. But as the gladiators fought in the arenas, they became more than just pawns. They became symbols of resistance, and in doing so, they challenged the very foundation of Roman society. Gladiator rebellions were a sign that Rome's control over its subjects was not as secure as the empire liked to believe. Now, let's take a deeper look at what it really meant to be a gladiator. Gladiators weren't just mindless killers. They were trained in specialized schools known as ludi, where their lives were strictly regimented. This intense training forged them into elite warriors who fought not just for their lives, but for the approval of the public. The brutal nature of gladiatorial combat made them into heroes. Heroes who, despite their status as slaves, were loved by the people. But with this fame came the desire for freedom, and for some gladiators, rebellion was the only path to escape the arena. The gladiators' fight for freedom wasn't just about physical combat. It was about challenging the social hierarchy of Rome. Gladiators were often from the lower classes, and their rebellion symbolized the growing divide between the wealthy elite and the oppressed masses. The rebellion was not just a fight for survival, it was a fight against a system that kept the lower classes subjugated. Gladiators wanted more than just their freedom. They wanted to overturn the system that kept them enslaved. As these gladiator rebellions grew stronger, they presented a direct challenge to Rome's military dominance. The growing unrest not only threatened the empire's stability, but it exposed the cracks in its governance that no emperor could ignore. The gladiators' rebellion, combined with the political chaos caused by Macrinus, led to a period of great instability in Rome. Eventually, Macrinus' inability to deal with these uprisings, combined with the lack of support from his own military, led to his downfall. The gladiators had made their mark, not just on the battlefield, but on the very power structures of Rome. But did they succeed? Not entirely. Many of the gladiators, including Spartacus, met tragic ends. Yet, despite their defeat, their legacy of defiance lived on. They became symbols of resistance, showing that even the most oppressed people could challenge the power of the empire. In the end, the gladiator rebellions mattered to Rome for one simple reason. They exposed the fragility of an empire that prided itself on its invincibility. These uprisings forced the Romans to confront the limits of their control, and ultimately the cost of their power. They also raised profound questions about the nature of freedom and what it means to live under an oppressive system. The story of these gladiators teaches us a timeless lesson, that even in the darkest of circumstances, resistance can spark change. It's a lesson that echoes through history, inspiring movements for freedom and justice, and one that continues to resonate today. The gladiators' fight for freedom wasn't just about survival, it was about challenging the very foundation of Roman society, and in doing so, they changed the course of history. How did the gladiators, slaves forced into brutal combat, end up becoming symbols of resistance? Their rebellions, while often viewed as mere acts of desperation, were much more than that. They shook the foundations of the Roman Empire itself, calling into question the very system that held the empire together. But what if I told you that their fight wasn't just about bloodshed? It was a deep ideological challenge to the core of Roman power. When we think of gladiators, we often imagine them as nothing more than pawns, forced into the arena to fight and die for the entertainment of the elite. However, the reality is far more complex. Many gladiators were warriors in their own right, highly trained fighters who were not just fighting for survival, but for something much larger, freedom. While some were slaves, others volunteered, hoping to gain fame, fortune, or escape from poverty. In fact, some saw the arena as a path to greater power, not just as a tool of oppression. What's fascinating is that the system that created these gladiators was not only about entertainment, but also about control. The gladiatorial games served as a political tool for the Roman elites. They were designed to distract and pacify the masses, while also reaffirming Rome's dominance. Gladiators, despite their status as slaves, had a surprising amount of influence over public opinion. A popular gladiator could become a hero, adored by the public, and their victories in the arena could provide them with a degree of freedom. But here's the twist. For many gladiators, the arena wasn't just a place of survival. It was a symbol of everything that was wrong with Roman society: the brutality, the oppression, and the inequality. Gladiators were often the victims of a corrupt system, but many saw the arena as a place to fight back. They began to dream of escaping this system and fighting not just for their own lives, but for the chance to bring down the empire's cruel power structures. One of the most famous gladiator rebellions in history was Spartacus' revolt. But did you know that Spartacus wasn't alone? In fact, there were several gladiator-led uprisings, each with its own surprising twists and turns. Spartacus' rebellion might be the most well-known, but there were other gladiators like Crixus, who led smaller but equally important revolts. These rebellions weren't just about freedom, they were about showing the world that the Roman Empire, with all its power, wasn't as invincible as it seemed. What made these rebellions so powerful wasn't just the sheer strength of the gladiators, it was the ideological challenge they posed to Rome. These uprisings weren't just personal revenge, they were a direct assault on the system that allowed the Romans to enslave and oppress millions. And even though many of these revolts were brutally crushed, they left a legacy of defiance that resonated long after the last gladiator had fallen. One of the most surprising aspects of these revolts was the role played by the Roman military. The same army that was supposed to protect the empire from revolt was often caught off guard by these uprisings. Some soldiers sympathized with the gladiators, seeing in them a reflection of their own struggles. But more importantly, these rebellions exposed cracks in the Roman military structure. They forced the empire to confront the limits of its control and its inability to quash dissent. And at the heart of these rebellions stood Macrinus, an emperor who ruled for only a short time, but whose reign was deeply impacted by the gladiator-led uprisings. Macrinus' rise to power was anything but traditional. He wasn't the heir to an empire. He didn't come from noble blood. Instead, he rose through a series of political maneuvers. His reign, which was filled with political challenges, coincided with a rise in gladiator-led uprisings, which put even more pressure on his rule. Macrinus, unlike other Roman emperors, didn't have the full support of the military elite. His attempts to suppress the gladiator uprisings were inconsistent and poorly executed. As the rebellions grew in strength, Macrinus found himself cornered. His failure to gain the support of key military leaders ultimately led to his downfall. The gladiators, with their uprisings, were not just challenging the power of the emperor. They were challenging the entire political system of Rome. But here's where it gets really interesting. What if I told you that some of the most powerful figures in Rome actually helped the gladiators? The gladiators, often seen as enemies of the state, found unexpected allies in the highest echelons of Roman society. Some military leaders and even senators sympathized with their cause. They saw the uprisings as a sign that Rome's power was fragile and that the system was corrupt. These alliances were often hidden, but they were critical in giving the gladiators a chance to succeed. However, it wasn't just about the gladiators and their struggle for freedom. These rebellions had a much broader impact on Roman society. They forced Rome to confront its own weaknesses and question its ability to maintain control of the empire. Gladiator uprisings were a wake-up call for the Roman elite. They were a reminder that no empire, no matter how powerful, can hold on to its grip forever if it fails to address the inequalities that threaten its very existence. In the aftermath of these revolts, Rome had to reconsider its policies towards slaves and military service. These rebellions were a sign that the empire's dependence on slavery and oppression was unsustainable. And while the gladiators may have been defeated in battle, their fight for freedom left a lasting legacy. It raised questions about the cost of power, and it showed that even the most oppressed. The story of these gladiators teaches us an important lesson. It reminds us that resistance, even in the most brutal circumstances, can spark significant change. The gladiators didn't just fight for their survival, they fought for an idea. They fought to challenge a system that had oppressed them for too long. Their struggles, though often tragic, showed that even the most oppressed have the power to change history. These revolts weren't just about rebellion, they were about something deeper. They were a call for justice, a demand for equality, and a challenge to the status quo. And the gladiators, despite their defeat, became symbols of resistance that continue to inspire people around the world who fight for freedom and justice. The lessons we can learn from their struggles still apply today. What if I told you that the true impact of the gladiator rebellions didn't just stop at the arena? These uprisings didn't just challenge the status quo. They reshaped Roman society in ways that are still relevant today. But how? What happened to Rome after these gladiators took their stand? Many think the gladiators' rebellions were quickly crushed, and that Rome simply went on unchanged. But the reality is, their defiance left a deeper mark than most realize. The reverberations of their struggles for freedom weren't just felt by the elite in Rome. They exposed profound flaws within the empire's structure, forcing the Romans to confront the very limits of their power. Let's think about this for a moment. Gladiator rebellions directly challenged the empire's ability to maintain control. While Rome often projected an image of invincibility, these uprisings were a harsh reminder that no empire, no matter how grand, can perpetually suppress a growing demand for justice and equality. Even the mightiest empires have their breaking points. Now, here's something most people don't consider. The gladiators' revolts forced a revaluation of the system that underpinned Roman society. Rome was built on a foundation of hierarchy, with the upper classes holding power over those below them. The gladiator rebellions showed that this system wasn't as solid as it appeared. What happens when the oppressed rise up? Rome found itself at a crossroads, with the very structure of its rule being challenged by the people it had subjugated for centuries. Consider the surprising result of these uprisings. They led to changes in Roman policies regarding both slaves and military service. Before these rebellions, slaves were seen merely as property, their lives expendable in the arena. But after the rebellions, the elite couldn't ignore the growing unrest among the lower classes. The empire had to confront the growing reality that an oppressed people, when pushed far enough, could bring an empire to its knees. The gladiators also made the Romans question the morality of their military system. What happens when the very soldiers tasked with suppressing rebellions begin to sympathize with the rebels? Their soldiers weren't just pawns in the system. They had human emotions and sympathies. When they witnessed the cruelty gladiators endured, some were moved to question the system they were serving. This tension between duty and morality created cracks in the foundation of Roman military power, leading to shifts in Roman tactics and policies. But it wasn't just the military and elite class that felt the impact. The public perception of emperors and the Roman elite was deeply altered by these uprisings. Gladiator rebellions brought to light the vulnerabilities of the empire. The public began to see the emperor and the ruling class in a different light, no longer as invincible figures of power, but as flawed leaders who could be overthrown by those they oppressed. The legacy of these revolts was powerful. Over time, the image of the gladiator as a mere slave changed. They became symbols of resistance, not just in Rome, but across the empire. The stories of their courage and defiance spread far and wide, inspiring future generations who would rise up against their oppressors. Even though the gladiators' rebellions ultimately failed, they succeeded in something far more important. They planted the seeds of revolution that would bear fruit in the centuries to come. Now, here's something that might surprise you. The very institution of gladiatorial games that once symbolized Rome's power became a symbol of its decline. After the rebellions, the games became less of a political tool and more of a spectacle, a way for the ruling class to maintain control by distracting the public from the empire's underlying issues. But the fact that it became a distraction highlights just how much of a threat the gladiators posed to the status quo. Ultimately, the gladiators' rebellions forced Rome to grapple with its own mortality. The empire's once iron grip on its people had loosened, and in that process, the foundations of Roman rule were shaken. These uprisings, though unsuccessful in their immediate goal of overthrowing the empire forced the Roman elite to rethink their strategies. They restructured parts of Roman society, particularly in how they dealt with slaves and military service, to prevent any future uprisings from escalating to the scale of the Gladiator rebellions. The rebellions didn't just change Roman society, they left a legacy that echoed through history. They showed that even the most oppressed, when united and determined, could challenge the powerful. The gladiators' fight for freedom didn't end in the arena. It ended with Rome looking at itself in the mirror and realizing that even the greatest empires have their limits. What if I told you that one of the most notorious and successful gladiator rebellions was more than just an attempt to escape captivity? What if the entire rebellion was an attack on the very foundation of Roman society itself, shaking the empire to its core? The gladiators' fight for freedom wasn't just about swords and shields. It was about a larger political, social, and military struggle that forced the Roman Empire to confront its own limitations. The story of gladiator rebellions, particularly during the reign of Macrinus, reveals hidden tensions within the empire, and that's what we're diving into today. Let's uncover how these gladiators, outcasts and slaves, ignited a fire that changed the course of Roman history. Macrinus' reign, though brief, played a crucial role in the backdrop of the gladiator uprisings. Most people might think that his reign was insignificant compared to other Roman emperors, but the truth is far more surprising. Macrinus wasn't the emperor many expected. His ascent to the throne came not by bloodline or military conquest, but through political maneuvering, and this made his reign particularly fragile. He had enemies not just in the military but also among the Roman elites, who saw his rise as a threat to the established order. In the chaos of his short reign, one of the most unexpected challenges he faced was the gladiator rebellions. You might not know this, but it was the gladiators, not just the legions, that threatened Macrinus' hold over the empire. The gladiators' rebellion was far more than a series of isolated uprisings. It was a powerful, coordinated act of defiance against the very heart of Roman control. For centuries, gladiators had been tools of entertainment and symbols of Rome's might. But this rebellion was different. The gladiators weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for a new future, one where the balance of power wasn't controlled by the few but by the many. What started as a revolt for personal freedom quickly became a fight against the oppressive Roman system itself. The gladiators were slaves, captured in battle or condemned by the state, but many of them were volunteers as well. They were fighters seeking not just freedom but fame and fortune. Some gladiators, like Spartacus, became famous for their leadership and rebellion, but there were many others whose stories have been lost to history. These gladiators didn't just want to run, they wanted to overturn the system that kept them subjugated. Their fight wasn't simply for escape, it was a radical challenge to the very core of Roman society, which saw them as nothing more than property. This rebellion showed that even in the most brutal, dehumanizing circumstances, resistance can rise. Macrinus' inability to effectively respond to these rebellions further weakened his position. Unlike other emperors, Macrinus didn't have the loyalty of the Roman military elites, and he was increasingly isolated politically. His approach to managing the gladiators' uprisings was inconsistent at best. He failed to form alliances with the military leaders who could have helped him put down the revolts, and his decisions led to internal conflict within the Roman leadership. As the gladiator rebellions grew in strength, Macrinus found himself facing a rebellion not just from slaves but from powerful factions within his own empire. The gladiators' struggle for freedom exposed serious fractures in the Roman power structure. What might surprise you is that some of Rome's most powerful figures, including senators and military leaders, saw the gladiators' uprising as a symptom of Rome's corruption and decay. Some even secretly sympathized with their cause. These unexpected allies, though not openly supportive, gave the gladiators the strength they needed to continue their rebellion. Macrinus, already on shaky ground, faced not only an uprising from the gladiators but also internal challenges from the Roman elite. These allies, though hidden, played a key role in ensuring that the gladiator rebellion wasn't easily squashed. Rome's political system was so unstable at this point that even the highest powers couldn't ignore the gladiators' fight for freedom. While we know the fate of Spartacus and his legendary death, the fates of other gladiator leaders were just as dramatic. Many of them fought to the end, trying to carve out a space for their people to live freely, but their efforts were often crushed with brutal force. These leaders didn't just die for their cause, they became martyrs, symbols of resistance that lived on in the hearts of the people. Some, though, found themselves caught in the same system they had rebelled against, forever trapped by the very structures they had sought to dismantle. Their ultimate fate was tragic, yet their actions had a profound impact on the Roman world. The gladiators' last stand showed that even in death, they could challenge the power of Rome and leave a legacy that would inspire future rebellions. The gladiators' fight wasn't just about survival, it was about sending a message that power could be questioned. Forced Rome to reckon with its limitations, pushing the empire to reconsider how it treated its subjects. From slaves to soldiers, the rebellions not only raised questions about the treatment of gladiators, but also about the broader social and political structures that upheld the empire. They exposed cracks in Roman society that no emperor, no matter how powerful, could ignore. In many ways, the gladiators' uprising was a warning to Rome. The power of the empire was not invincible, and the oppressed could rise to challenge the elite. In the aftermath, Rome had had to adapt. While it didn't completely dismantle the system that led to the gladiator uprisings, it did force changes. Laws were enacted that affected the treatment of slaves and soldiers. The gladiatorial games, which had once been a tool of control, began to lose their hold over the public. The elite class could no longer rely on the games to maintain their power without considering the consequences. The gladiators had achieved something that no emperor had expected. They had reshaped Roman society from the bottom up. Today, the gladiator uprisings serve as a reminder that even in the most oppressive systems, resistance can take root. The struggles of these ancient rebels continue to inspire movements for freedom and justice around the world. The gladiators' fight wasn't just about swords. It was about the power of unity, defiance, and the belief that freedom is worth fighting for no matter the cost. Their legacy challenges us to question the systems that oppress us and to fight for a future where freedom is truly for all. What if I told you that one of the most surprising and impactful rebellions in ancient Rome wasn't led by any of the famous names you might think of? In fact, it wasn't even a single rebellion led by a singular hero, but rather multiple uprisings by gladiators, slaves, fighters, and those in the most desperate of situations, against the very system that kept them chained. Gladiators weren't just pawns in the Roman Empire. They were warriors who fought for survival, but some sought something far greater: freedom and justice. Their struggle wasn't just about blood and swords, it was about revolution, and their fight had massive consequences for Rome, particularly during the brief reign of Emperor Macrinus. As we dive into the surprising connection between the gladiator uprisings and the downfall of Macrinus, we'll uncover how the actions of those forced to fight for their lives brought to light the deep political fractures in the Rome. And these gladiators, often seen as mere entertainment, had the power to challenge one of the world's most powerful empires. But how did they do it, and why was their rebellion so significant? Let's start by exploring what it meant to be a gladiator in ancient Rome, and how their fight for freedom revealed the weaknesses in the Roman system. Did you know that not all gladiators were victims of the arena? In fact, many gladiators weren't just slaves. They were volunteers who chose the life of a gladiator, seeking fame, fortune, and for some, the ultimate form of freedom. Gladiators trained in brutal conditions, often in schools known as ludi, where they were turned into highly skilled warriors. But this wasn't just for survival. Gladiators, in many cases, had the chance to gain significant status, even as they fought for their lives. Some gained fame and wealth, eventually being freed by their masters if they performed well enough. Others, however, sought freedom in a different way, through rebellion. Gladiators weren't just forced into battle for the amusement of the Roman elite. Their struggles represented something larger, a challenge to the Roman social order. The system that forced them into the arena was one that oppressed the lower classes. Gladiators, though slaves, had the potential to rise above their station, and for many, that spark of hope was enough to ignite a fight for freedom. Many of them chose to use their skills to escape the brutal system, sometimes leading rebellions that shook the foundations of Rome itself. But how did the gladiators rise up? It wasn't just the famed Spartacus who led these uprisings. The most well-known rebellion, the Third Servile War, was led by Spartacus, but there were others who also fought for freedom, such as Crixus and smaller, less-known revolts. These uprisings weren't just about gaining freedom for the gladiators themselves. They were an attack on the power structure of Rome. Gladiators, in their fight for survival, became a symbol of resistance. And while some fought for revenge against their captors, others sought a radical overhaul of the Roman political system, which they saw as fundamentally unjust. This brings us to the role of Emperor Macrinus, a ruler who, despite his short reign, played a pivotal role in the unfolding of these gladiator rebellions. Macrinus was an emperor who wasn't born into royalty. Instead, he seized power through a series of political maneuvers. He wasn't the emperor that the Roman elite had expected, and his reign was filled with internal conflicts and challenges. One of the key issues he faced was the growing instability within the empire, and a crucial element in that instability was the gladiators' rebellion. Macrinus, unlike many of his predecessors, struggled to align with the Roman military elite. His inability to gain their full support led to his eventual downfall. But more than just the political elite, the gladiator uprisings highlighted the weakness in Rome's military and political systems. Gladiators, often seasoned fighters with military experience, were able to use their combat skills to successfully challenge Roman forces. But Macrinus didn't just face military threats from within his own empire. He also faced the increasing pressure of a system that was breaking down under the weight of its own corruption. As the gladiators' uprisings grew in strength, the cracks in Rome's governance became more evident. The military wasn't always loyal to Macrinus, and the soldiers themselves were increasingly sympathetic to the gladiators' cause. This was not just about a rebellion from below. It was a sign that Rome's powerful military machine, long seen as an unshakable force, was losing control. Macrinus' attempts to quell these uprisings were often inconsistent, lacking the strong leadership needed to maintain control. His inability to act decisively allowed the rebellion to spread, and as the gladiators fought back, they exposed the fragility of the Roman power structure. Macrinus' short reign was marked by this instability. His failure to secure the loyalty of key military leaders, combined with his inability to stop the growing gladiator uprisings, ultimately led to his assassination. The gladiators' rebellion didn't just threaten the authority of a single emperor. It revealed the deep-seated deep-seated issues within the empire that no emperor, no matter how powerful, could ignore. In the end, the gladiators' fight for freedom wasn't just a struggle for individual liberty, it was a revolutionary act against the very heart of the Roman Empire. Their actions exposed the weaknesses in the system, forcing the empire to confront the limits of its control. The uprisings weren't just about freedom for the slaves, they were a statement that even the mightiest empire could be challenged, not just by armies, but by those it oppressed. These gladiators, once seen as tools of entertainment, became symbols of resistance. Their legacy didn't just shake the foundations of Roman power, it showed that the oppressed could and would rise up to challenge the powerful. And the story of their rebellion is a testament to the power of resistance, even in the face of overwhelming odds. You've learned the incredible truth behind the gladiator rebellions and how their resistance wasn't just about blood in the arena. It wasn't simply a fight for survival, it was a fight that shook the very foundations of Roman society. From the unexpected alliances formed in the shadows to the rise and fall of Emperor Macrinus, this entire period in history is far more complex than most people realize. As we wrap up, let's reflect on how the gladiators' struggle for freedom continues to offer valuable lessons to this day, revealing timeless truths about power, oppression, and the courage to fight for what is right. It's often said that history is written by the victors, but in the case of the gladiator rebellions, it's the story of the oppressed that we should remember. Despite their brutal circumstances, these warriors fought not just for freedom, but to dismantle the power structure that had controlled them for centuries. They had no army, no resources, but what they did have was courage, unity, and a cause that resonated with the masses. Their actions exposed the flaws in the Roman system and forced the empire to confront the very idea of power and control. The reign of Macrinus, though short-lived, was undeniably influenced by the gladiator uprisings. It wasn't just the immediate chaos they caused, but the deeper unrest that highlighted cracks in the Roman Empire. Macrinus' inability to manage these uprisings ultimately led to his downfall. But the real question is, how did the gladiators manage to reach the point where they could challenge the might of Rome? The answer lies in the political environment of the time and the sheer desperation of those who fought in the arena. They weren't just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for an entire class of people who had been silenced by the system. What's truly remarkable is how these gladiators managed to inspire support from unexpected sources. Military leaders, even senators, found themselves sympathizing with their cause. They saw the gladiators not as rebels but as symbols of a deeper issue within the empire. And in some cases, these unlikely allies gave the gladiators the support they needed to challenge Rome's authority. As we conclude, we have to ask, why did it take so long for the empire to address the root cause of these uprisings? What lessons can we learn from these revolts that still apply today? The gladiators' fight for freedom wasn't just about breaking free from chains. It was about breaking free from an unjust system, one that prioritized power over people. The story of these rebellions isn't just one of violence and bloodshed. It's a story of resistance. It's a story of how even the most oppressed can rise up and change the course of history. Today, we can draw inspiration from their bravery, knowing that no matter how oppressive a system may seem, there's always a possibility for change. And in that, we find hope. The story of the gladiators continues to remind us that we all have the power to challenge the powerful, to question authority, and to stand up for justice, no matter the odds. So the next time you think about the gladiators and their struggles, remember that it wasn't just about fighting in the arena. It was about fighting for freedom, fighting for justice, and fighting to break the chains that held not just their bodies, but the very spirit of rebellion. Their legacy is a testament to the power of resistance and the belief that even in the darkest of times, change is possible. If you enjoyed this epic journey, please subscribe to our channel for more thrilling historical tales. Don't miss out on new videos. Hit the notification bell to stay updated.